Hello, this is Henry Imler, and this is my third attempt to record this lecture. My software had problems the first two times, so hopefully I'll be able to keep this shorter since it's the third time I've done it. Hopefully it works this time. So this is our intro to logic lecture. And what we are going to be talking about is a little bit about logic itself, and then about critical thinking and what we mean when we say critical thinking. So logic itself is just the systematic study of reasoning. And within this field, we have two major branches that we'll be dealing with. So the first part of the class, we will be looking at, what are the components of arguments? How do we determine true statements? That kind of stuff. How do we distinguish between arguments versus explanations? All of those types of things. But then we'll get into the key types of logic. The first one is what we call formal logic, and that's known as deductive reasoning. And with deductive reasoning, the really neat thing about it is if you have true or good inputs, so like true premises, and the very structure, and that's why we call it formal, the very structure of the reasoning itself is good, and we'll say valid will be the term we use, then you can be assured that the conclusion is true. And so arguments that have true premises and valid reasoning are what we call sound arguments. And that's going to be the kind of arguments we try to craft or find, right, when we go to evaluate them. Then the other branch of logic is informal logic. And this is what we call inductive reasoning. And instead of the kind of certainty that we have with formal logic can be fun because you know exactly what you're getting. It's almost like math. Or at least basic math. If you have the right numbers and you have the right equation and you think well, you're going to have the right answer, and everyone should have the right answer. Now, that doesn't deal with all types of thinking or reasoning. Sometimes we have to deal with probabilities, and that where we reason from general to the specific or specific to the general. But we deal with probabilistic conclusions. And we say, if we do this well, then it's highly likely that this conclusion is true. But it still means there's a certain probability that it might be false. So a lot of our reasoning just out in the world is inductive in nature, but there is still that class of deductive reasoning, and one of our goals is to get good at both and get good at identifying good deductive and good inductive reasoning. So that's logic, and we'll talk a little bit more about the foundation of logic and some issues later. But then we have this idea of critical thinking, and when we talk about critical thinking, one of the things that we are concerned about is let's back up a second. Everyone agrees about what logic is. What people don't agree upon is what critical thinking is. There's a million definitions, depending upon who's saying it. But everyone agrees that critical thinking is good and useful. So the way we're going to use it in this class is we're going to think of it as constant, and then this will be our key phrase, recursive thinking, right? So that's going to be the main attribute that we have. And so let's talk a little bit about critical thinking and then its primary opposite, authoritarian thinking. So we'll run through authoritarian thinking first. So we are given at some point in our lives, from the very beginning, but also throughout all of it, we're giving a certain interpretation of the world. Your family might call it common sense, but there's lots of terms for it. And we get this from the authorities in our life, whether they are the books we've read, the religious figures we talk to, our interpretation of religious texts that we use, our politicians, our families, our friends, our teachers, etc. But we get all these inputs, and those are then assembled into a worldview, a way of seeing the world, but also the better term for it that we'll use in this class is ideology. Now, ideology is extremely important. Sometimes you see it used in a pejorative or negative sense, but it's actually really, really important. I like to think about it as glasses for someone with poor eyesight. So without these glasses, it's hard for me to see, and not necessarily see, it's hard for me to understand the world. So I might see a red blob out in the distance, and I might not know what that is. Is that like a ball? Is that an apple? Is it a toy? Is it a container? I don't know what it is. It's blurry. I can't see it. And I can't make sense of it. And that's the important thing. I can't make sense of it. But when I look at the object through my glasses, suddenly it comes into focus, and I'm able to understand what the thing is and what I can do with it. Do I give it to my dog to play with? If it's a dog toy, or if it's a little apple, well, I can eat it for sustenance. Suddenly, like, things have meaning. But ideology goes deeper than that. It's a comprehensive framework for understanding the world. And because of that, it allows us to understand who we are and who others are, what their place is in the world, etc. So it's tied down into our understanding of self. And so to threaten or change an ideology, you often threaten the understanding of yourself in the world. And that's very scary. It's very scary. And we'll see kind of some implications of that in a little bit. But we need to talk about an example. So this is an example from myself growing up. So I grew up in a system of thought that had an anti-environmental stance. And the idea was, the reasoning was, God is about to come back and in the book of Revelation, in the Christian New Testament, God says that he is going to destroy the heavens and the earth with fire. So God is about to destroy earth with fire. And then in that, God makes a new heavens and a new earth in that book. But that's a sacred text of my upbringing. Actually, it's still a sacred text of mine. But if God is about to destroy the world with fire, and again, in this line of thinking, this is supposed to happen like within our generation. Well, then that means we can use the earth as we see fit. In fact, early on in Genesis, we're given charge. Humans are put in charge of the earth. And so if it's about to go away, why not extract as much value and resources out of it as possible? Why would we need to protect it? Because it's going to go away soon. And so this leads to a stance of, well, we don't have to worry about the environment, and it's okay to try to make as much money off the environment as possible, right? So that might lead to other views, right? Such as, well, we should not have government regulations telling us what we can and cannot do with the environment. Not only does it go against this notion of freedom, but also it impinges our ability to extract resources. And again, this comes out of this religious view that I was given as a child and teenager. But so let's say I have that, right? So you might disagree with it, you might hold it yourself, but it's just an example. So then, right, so we have this ideology, and then we're given new inputs, right? So maybe some of these new inputs, and again, you can agree or disagree with this, but this is going to be our example for now. Maybe we start reading the religious text a little more deeply, and we find other passages that we weren't aware of, such as the idea of creation care. in the Psalms, in Genesis itself, etc. So we have this idea of creation care in our religious texts that we weren't aware about before. And then maybe we are aware about science and history that shows that humans are damaging the environment in whatever way. Maybe there's lots of ways that we're doing this. But with these two new inputs, suddenly, let's say that we take these things as true. Suddenly, we're faced with a choice, right? We have option 2 and option 1. Option 1 would be, well, we have new inputs. They show that our old way of viewing the world has problems, and so then now we need to revise our view. And so we might be led to say, well, climate change is a problem, and it's a big deal, and we need to take care of creation instead of kind of using it as a expendable resource. And this might even lead us to additional ideas, like maybe we need to have regulations about how we use water, how we manage forests, how we protect certain animals, etc., right? So this is one possibility. This is one possibility up here. The other possibility, we'll kind of just use pink or purple, whatever this is. The other possibility is we can find ways to preserve our ideology, right? So this is our second option. We either revise or we preserve, right? And so here we defend one's ideology. And again, notice, this is a natural, almost self-preservation reaction, right? So we might say it's a gut reaction done out of self-defense. Because again, remember that having one's ideology challenges your understanding of self, and that's a very dangerous prospect. And so we might have to come up with ways to fix the new input to where they don't threaten. And so maybe with this religious case, maybe we find ways of reading the contrary texts where we discount them. So maybe we ignore those texts that talk about creation care. Or maybe we privilege text A over text B. So if yes, we're supposed to tend the earth like a garden under this religious view that I'm talking about, yeah, but now that God is about to burn it up, well, that means that that text takes precedent or privileges, or we use it instead of text B, right? So that's a possible one. Another method of discounting is to kind of play, I don't want to say identity politics, but we can just say my ideology says that this other method of reading the scripture is invalid, right? So you might say, if you're a conservative religious, you have a conservative religious approach to reading texts, that way of reading the text is not a good way of reading the text. Because it's a liberal reading of the text, it must therefore be bad. Or, you can easily have the flip. So I know people that I have dear friends who do both. They're on both sides on this. Who say that's a conservative method of reading a text. Therefore, we shouldn't use it on that basis. So we can just completely discount the interpretive approach. Those are two kind of private ways that we can do this. But let's say that, let's expand that out to communal ways of short-circuiting critical thinking in this type of a case. And so we'll use just two examples. So there's a ton. So the first thing we might do, let's say you work in a church who holds to this position here, right? This anti-environmental basis. Let's say you work for one of those institutions and you come to this new thinking, right? Well, maybe people threaten to fire you, right? Or maybe the last person who came to this conclusion and started making a fuss about it in the church, they got fired, right? And you're a person who needs to feed their family. You need to feed your partner, you need to feed your kids, etc. Right? So you learn to keep your mouth shut. Or from the standpoint of the community, if you don't keep your mouth shut, we expel you from the polis. We get rid of you. We fire you. And I can give you cases of this happening in churches and in religious educational institutions. Maybe not along these lines, but certainly along several other lines. So the second thing we can do, now this is very kind of overt and, well, whenever you get threatened, that elicits a defensive response. But something else we can do, and this is, how do you say it? It's insidiously brilliant. We can create a false dilemma and say, well, here are your options. Pick between these two. We're very tolerant. Here are the possible options here. And but really they're narrow options. And there's a lot of other possibilities out there, but we only say there's these two narrow ones. And so let's look at politics real quick without getting into like specifics on this issue. So in our country, we think about the last election cycle. We tend to have liberal positions. We tend to have the conservative camp, the liberal camp, and then people who at least claim to be moderate, but they end up actually being liberal or conservative. But they value at least the ideal of being moderate. Now notice, whenever you are liberal, you have a whole set of positions that you are supposed to agree with, or you're a bad liberal. And then on the same side, if you're conservative, you have a whole set of positions that you have to hold to in order to be a good conservative, right? So you get these bundles of issues. Now, so let's say over here with, oh, I don't want to do this one, choose it. So let's say this one is being pro-choice. That in order to be a good liberal, one that's not excluded from the liberal polis, you have to be pro-choice. And let's say the opposite of that, you have to be pro-life over here on the conservative side. And so that's like supposed to be your only two options. And then along with that comes this notion that you have to be against public spending on social welfare programs if you're a conservative, right? You want to minimize that expense, and you want to minimize taxes in order to achieve that. And then because of your views on sex or whatever, you also have to hold to the idea that in terms of teaching, we have to hold to abstinence-only education. And then you have the opposite over here. So we need to have a robust social safety net for just anyone. We have to have sex education that's sex positive or something like that. And then we need to have higher rates of taxation in order to fund all these things. And maybe in the blue there's also free contraception. So you have these bundle of issues and they're opposite. And supposedly you have to be one or the other. But let's say that this is actually a false choice, is what I want to say. So maybe you are very pro-life, but you think that the way to reduce abortions, which is one of your goals as someone who identifies as pro-life in this country, you might say, okay, well, how do I do that? I mean, yeah, if I just said it don't have sex, that would solve it. But let's say people end up having sex anyway, and so, well, what's a good way to like prevent pregnancies that would result in abortion? Well, one is maybe to have a good social safety net, right? If having the child doesn't cost you thousands of dollars, or if you then have enough food. So let's say you're poor and you're going to add another mouth to feed to your family. Well, maybe you figure out, I don't have the budget for that. I don't get paid that much at my job to where I can feed another person. If you've had kids, you know that they are expensive. So maybe you say we need a robust safety net. We need to pay for it. so we need higher taxes. And then, well, what's a great way for people not to have kids? Well, teach them about sex education. If you're going to have sex, here's how to do it safely. Here's how to do it without getting pregnant. And maybe let's give people free contraception. That way it's easy for them to do things that don't result in pregnancy. And so then, if you look at all of this, you actually have this hybrid position. But because over here you hold this position, the liberals are going to hate you, or at least not hate. That's a little extreme word. They're going to say, well, you're not good enough for us. And then because you hold these positions over here, the conservatives will say, well, we don't like you either, right? So because of that, we notice that this is actually a false dilemma. You can have these composite views. So let's look at this in another. You'll see this chart, or a better version of this chart, next week. Well, actually, you know what? I think this is a good enough example of the false dilemma. So let's just move on, because this will save us about 10 minutes, and we'll deal with it next week. Okay, so that is authoritarian thinking. So if you take kind of this green path, right, where you have this ideology that's formed on the basis of all of these inputs that you get from family, friends, religious authorities, political views, whatever, media that you watch, whatever. It can be a lot of inputs. And you form an ideology, but then you come across new inputs. Well, you have a choice. If you don't go with the purple where you do the revision, and you go with the second path, well, that's authoritarian thinking. And we contrast this with critical thinking down here. In critical thinking, we have the same inputs. We have that, we have that same input. You just can't escape it. And then you have the ideology, but also thinking process, right? This is where you think about inputs, and then you form an ideology. But then whenever you come across new inputs, instead of trying to preserve what you have for the sake of that security of keeping your identity or keeping your job, etc., instead you have this recursive thinking, right, where you go and you say, okay, wait, maybe I need to reevaluate this. So you return back to the thinking phase, right, which produces maybe either the same ideology, maybe you don't change, and that's totally fine. Sometimes you get new inputs and they reinforce what you already think. That can be an excellent thing. That can happen. Or maybe you have to revise, so revision is possible. Not that you have to revise it, but that you're open to revising. And this kind of purple process where we emphasize recursive thinking, though that almost you can't see. Recursive thinking is the key idea of critical thinking. And so what are the things that we have here when we do critical thinking? Well, we have constant questioning. We seek quality input, so we have to figure out what's trash, what's quality, what's useful, what's not useful, what is authoritative, what's not. A whole host of questions. And we'll be dealing with this throughout the class. We have to be be open to questioning. We have to seek out and figure out what are quality inputs. And then we have to be open to reviving our stances. And again, I do want to emphasize and really empathize with people, because being open to revising your stances is scary, right? So I get this green path because it is secure, right? I keep my sense of self. I'm not threatened. And so it actually takes, I'm not calling the people in green cowards, but it does take courage to be open to revising your stances. And so what we want to do during the critical thinking phase of this class is to develop these skills, right? So we want to develop skills. We want to instill attitudes. So, essentially we want to develop a virtue, a habit. A habit of critical thinking, because this does not come automatically. This is something you have to work at, you have to develop, you have to practice in order to get good at it. So that's going to be our basic approach to critical thinking. We'll be talking about logic as we go on, but thank you for watching. Hopefully this is helpful, and I'll see you later.